Today, I am joined by one of the most controversial figures in British history, Arthur Scargill. Once leader of the NUM and now the leader of the Socialist Labour Party. Arthur, if you don't mind me asking, why is it that you want to leave the EU?
I think the reasons for leaving the European Union are so obvious that repeating them becomes a chore. Tony Benn spelled it out very clearly. It's to get back democracy into our society. When we joined the European Economic Community, that's the EEC, we did so with a decision by Parliament only. And that led us into a trap, because it was obvious from the start that the European Community would become a United States of Europe, and we're well on the way to that. The problem with the European Union is that it takes away all the decision making from the British Parliament. Members of Parliament are lent their powers by the electorate to take decisions on their behalf. But that presents a problem, because the European Union now dictates what the policy shall be, whether it's on economic policy, whether it's on social policy or political policy. And in every respect, we are now subservient to the European Union. I'll give you one example. Before we joined the EU, 80% of our economy was based in manufacturing. Today, only 10% is based in manufacturing. That's been the price of membership of the EU. And that, of course, means mass unemployment. And that's the case today. Don't believe the figures of 1.4 million. The real figure, according to the Roundtree Foundation Trust, is 5.5 billion who are looking for work but can't get it, or they're on short-term contracts, which quite frankly are equal to slave labour.
What would you say with the battle bus, with the extra funding for the NHS? How would you oppose that?
Well, my view is it underestimated the position. It's only about, 1.5 billion to 2 billion, if it is taken literally. But on the other hand, look at the economics of our trade with the European Union, and then compare it with the rest of the world. Each year, our trade with the European Union countries leaves Britain 80 billion in deficit. Our trade with the rest of the world produces a £40 billion surplus. Now, you've got to be an economic nutcase to go along with a policy like that. So in the event that we come out of the European Union, and we should have done that on day one, we would at least be 80 billion to the good. In other words, you've got to take the whole into consideration. I remember speaking in Dublin and being asked about a question that affected them. They said 40% of our trade is with the European Union, and that's why we are pro-European. What's your answer to that, Mr. Scargill? And I said, simple. Out of the 40% that you trade with the European Union, 25% is with the United Kingdom. And if you take that into account, it's only 15% that you trade with Europe. In other words, you're being done, but you don't realise it yet.
I'm going to ask you a quite unusual question now. Anarchists believe you shouldn't have a state at all, while liberals believe in limited role of the state. How involved do you think the state should be in British politics?
Well, I've no time for anarchists for a start, even though I've encountered them all through my working and political life. But the thing is, there's no difference between a state on the one hand and individuals and collective on the other. We should have a system of society that recognises that a state is reflective of what they want and believe. In other words, it's indivisible. As far as I'm concerned, as a Marxist, I want to see a state that reflects the will of the people. I want to see, for example, the means of production, distribution and exchange transferred into the ownership of the British people, into the control of the British people. If we did that, we would have a thriving and developing economy. And also, of course, an economy that gave social justice to people in all terms. And politically, we should stop spending billions on war in NATO and other silly areas and say we'll use that money to preserve life rather than spend it to kill life.
Right. Well, but the Labour Party at the moment seems to be divided on Brexit and especially with Tom Watson on the anti-Semitism claims with Jeremy Corbyn. What would you say about that?
Well, first of all, it's a strange and developing situation. And to understand it, you need to understand the Friends of Israel lobby group. It's like the Jewish lobby in America. They are dependent for their obsession, and that's what it is, on supporting the state of Israel. Israel, by the way, is an artificial state that was made in the Middle East, and it's been a thorn in world politics ever since. The people who support the concept of Israel mustn't be attacked under any circumstances are the ones who are currently attacking Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn's view on this, in my view, is correct, that we should be allowed at all times to criticise the state of Israel, which is no different from the situation we saw in South Africa under the apartheid regime, which maimed and killed hundreds of thousands of people. And that's exactly what the state of Israel is doing to the people of Palestine, whose land they occupy unlawfully. It's interesting, you know, that people in Parliament like Tom Watson will argue that the Russians should get out of Crimea, ignoring the fact that Crimea was previously part of the Soviet Union. But they don't say a thing about the state of Israel occupying lands in contravention of United Nations policy. But these groups, the Friends of Israel and the Zionists in Britain, are the ones who are really trying to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn. It's another attempt at coup. People like Tom Watson, Chuka Amuno, Neil Kinnock's son and others, I know what I would do if I was in Jeremy Corbyn's position. I'd either sack them or, if the constituencies are listening, get rid of them, deselect them, because they're mounting a campaign consistently against Corbyn that could cost Labour the next general election. And that really may be the overall aim, because the Zionists are only a fraction of the Jewish community. I don't know if you know this, but in Britain today there are something like 263,000 people of Jewish origin. But out of that, only 14% support Labour. So that this grouping that's now mounting consistently the issue of Zionism and anti-Zionism and anti-apartheid all the way along the line are the ones who are creating problems. Jeremy Corbyn is not anti-Semitic. He's condemned anti-Semitism all throughout his life. But it's not the Zionism that they want. They want it tied irrevocably to the state of Israel. And that's the problem. But it's only one of a number of issues where there's been attempts to deselect Jeremy Corbyn. But there's a difference. The mass of the Labour Party clearly support Corbyn. And the members of Parliament are the ones who are in the wrong. For example, 70% of members of Parliament in the Tory party represent constituencies who voted to leave the European Union. 60% of Labour Party constituencies voted to leave the European Union. If they were doing their job, they would be reflecting the will of the people. In other words, the state will be reflecting the will of the British people and getting out of Europe and getting out quick.
Staying with Corbyn, what do you think about his view on Brexit? How do you think he's taking the whole situation?
I think that Jeremy, unfortunately, is playing to the gallery to some degree, and I'm sad about that. I've been a personal friend of Jeremy Corbyn for well over 40 years. I campaigned with Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn in 1975 against Britain joining the European Common Market, and I have campaigned consistently with Jeremy Corbyn against membership of Britain within the European Union. It can't make compromises on a principled position like membership of the EU. What he should say very clearly is that Britain should come out of the European Union, out of the customs union, out of the single market, and there is no way that Britain should have anything to do with the free movement, as it's called, of capital and labour. The nomenclature of that is a nonsense, quite frankly. There's no such thing as free movement. What they do, they move their businesses abroad simply because they can get workers to work for less money. And of course they bring migrant labour into Britain in order that they can work for less money than British workers who can't get a job. So don't mix up migrant labour with immigration. I'm all in favour of immigration and asylum seekers seeking a safe haven, but I'm totally opposed, and always have been, to migrant labour just being allowed to cross borders. Once you have that, you could have 2 million people going into, say, Ireland, and the place would sink. You couldn't possibly sustain it. But that's the kind of policy that you've got in Europe, and that's why Jeremy Corbyn should come out cleanly and say that he's in tune with the will of the British people who voted in 2016 to come out of the European Union.
Well, you say you're opposed to migrant immigration. Well, what if there's a shortage of one job? Don't you feel we should get immigrants from another country to fill those roles? Or
Well, I didn't say I was opposed to immigration. I said I was opposed to migrant labour. There's a difference. It's interesting, you know, if you look at the figures. The total number of people coming in 2015, 2016 from the European Union was around 600,000. The total number of immigrants and asylum seekers was around 250,000. The interesting thing is that the number of people leaving Britain during the same period was about 280,000. So if my maths are right, there were more people leaving Britain to go and live in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, wherever, than there were coming in as immigrants or asylum seekers. The problem isn't immigration, the problem is migrant labour. And migrant labour has had a profound effect upon the economy of Britain because it's led to mass unemployment. And the figures, of course, are a complete lie. We don't have simply 1.4 million unemployed. If you look at the Roundtree Foundation Trust and its analysis of those people who are seeking work, there are 5.5 million people who want a job. So why can't we use our own skills and ingenuity to do that? Incidentally, Britain was once the powerhouse of the world. We produced the best cars, the finest steel, the best quality coal, and of course the finest aircraft anywhere in the world. All of it now produced abroad. It's high time that we started to produce our own. One glaring example. We used to produce 90% of our own food, and certainly we did that in the Second World War with no alternative. But today we only produce 59% of our own food. It really is a crime that farmers are being spent time and costing money not to grow food for the British people. It's high time that was reversed. It's interesting, you know, when you look at it. We're importing Danish bacon, and yet we've got farmers who are pig farmers who can produce the finest pork in the world, but for some reason we're importing at an enormous cost Danish bacon instead of producing British bacon. We're allowing other people to fish in our waters. Why not allow our fishermen to fish in our waters, as was the case before we joined the European Union? There's a sensible way of dealing with this. Get Britain out of the European Union now. No policy, no argument, no deal with Monsieur Barnier and others. We want to come out of the European Union and back into the world.
In your view, what is the fundamental difference between the left's view on Brexit and the right's view on Brexit?
Well, it's a good question and it deserves a fair answer. It is a fundamental difference between the right and the left. But that's not something that's new. Throughout history we've seen campaigns about issues where the right have an argument and the left have an argument, and it seems that on those occasions the two can campaign together. For example, in the Second World War, the Soviet Union, which was communist, and Britain and America, which is capitalist, fought the Nazi threat and the Nazi horde from Germany and Japan and Italy. Now, that was obvious from anybody's point of view. It was necessary to defeat fascism, and it brought together two opposing views, but the objective was necessary. And equally today, the views of those who want basically to restore the British Empire want Britain to come out of the European Union for their reasons. Whereas as a socialist, I want Britain to come out of the European Union and back into the world. I want to trade with Cuba, I want to trade with South Africa, I want to trade with India and China. In other words, we want to trade with those countries that we know are producing a surplus for Britain and a surplus for them. It makes common sense economically, socially and politically. So it's not a new thing for opposing views to go in the same direction. Personally, I remember sharing platforms with people who wanted to end the production of nuclear power, both civilian and militarily. They for their reasons and me for my reasons. Both of us were right, the objective, but at the end of the day we did it for different reasons. And I wanted to see the end of nuclear power because of its dangers to human life. And of course it was highly expensive. And I see that Germany already have now abandoned nuclear power, as indeed so has America, because they know it's no longer a viable proposition. So they always get different approaches for the same objective, but for different reasons. And so never mix up the problem when two different views pursue what appears to be the same objective. It may be the end result is that in this case we get outside the European Union and back into the world. But I want to get back into a socialist world, not into a capitalist world. So the difference is obvious.
Governments have messed around with taxation systems. Tories always going for a lower rate of tax, and Labour tending to go for a higher rate of tax. What would be your taxation system that you would impose on Britain to fund things like university fees, NHS? How would you go about that?
Well, first of all, the policy that the Socialist Labour Party have is fundamentally different from anybody else's. We would scrap value-added tax. That is an iniquitous tax. It means that if someone like Richard Branson goes into a shop and an old age pensioner goes into a shop and spends money, both pay the same tax, 20%. That can't be right. We should scrap VAT immediately. By the way, it's a European tax, European Union tax. What we should have is income tax, taxed on people's income, whether it's directly on their salaries or their shares, whatever it may be, or their investments. In any event, at the end of the day, it's not something revolutionary or new, it's common sense. The Labour government in 1945-51, and even the Conservative government that followed it, had an income tax policy which had 70% income tax for the higher bracket taxpayers, and that funded the health service, the education system, and of course our social services. It really is a scandal, you know, if Germany can provide young people like yourself with free education at university, and yet in Britain you're running up a debt of £40,000 as a result of having to take a loan simply to study for the benefit of the nation. And yet these politicians, certainly the older generation, all got free education, both at secondary modern, grammar school level and university level, but they want you to have to pay. That's wrong. It should come out of income tax at the source, and if it was done that way, we could easily pay for all the facilities that we need.
Moving back on to Brexit, why do you think the youth voted, well, mainly to remain, and the older generation voted to leave?
I think the answer is a simple one. The younger generation, and that includes you of course, have known nothing else except membership of the European Union. And there's a fear amongst them that leaving the European Union will result in economic and social disaster. Nothing could be further from the truth. For example, pre-membership of the European Union or the European Common Market, students used to go abroad and study, and students from abroad used to come to Britain and study. No problem. And I can tell you from personal experience, when I was your age, I was travelling to France on a late night flight without any problem whatsoever to France, including having a good time, and there were no restrictions on my movement. So you can have movement without having membership of the European Union. They're artificially creating a fear amongst young people in particular that if we don't remain inside the European Union, it means economic, social and political disaster. It really is a lie. It's a monumental lie. You will see from the speeches of Tony Benn, who puts it very succinctly, all that we want is to get back democracy. All that we want is the right of self-determination. And if we can reach a position where the British people can say what they mean and ensure that it's made clear in Parliament that they are going to implement it, then we've got back the democracy that we needed and we had before entering the European Union. So it's no surprise that young people don't yet understand the benefit of leaving the European Union. But I'll bet you one thing, and I'm not a gambler, within 5 years of leaving the European Union, they'll say, why on earth didn't we do this 20 years ago?
My final question is, what do you think the future holds for Britain post-Brexit?
I think that post-Brexit, if it happens, and it should happen without a deal in my view, and no £40 billion to the European Union, I'd use that straight away to fund the National Health Service. That's a good question, isn't it? Secondly, it could be a real development for Britain. We could begin to expand. Our fishermen could begin to fish once again in their own waters without the intrusion of foreign fishermen coming in under the rights implemented by the European Union commissioners who are unelected. We could get back an agricultural policy where our farmers produce food for British families. And of course we could begin to develop at long last our own industries again, the steel industry, the engineering industry, the car industry. All of these are fundamental to the well-being of the economy of Britain, the social welfare of Britain, and the politics of Britain. If we get that, we can have a real future for Britain. I want a socialist Britain. That's why I'm a Marxist. That's why I'll fight till the day I die for that which I believe in.
Thank you very much, Arthur. Sadly, we're out of time. Thank you very much for sharing your views on the world's issues.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and it's not often that I'm interviewed by my grandson, so that's a first.
Thank you very much.